about Jeffrey Epstein and the Epstein files and where Congress is on that and legal developments and all the rest. But you've been talking all day about what happened this morning with James Comey appearing in court in Virginia and a trial date being set really much quicker than everybody thought would happen. So walk me through what you've been talking about and hearing.
Well, it's such a fundamentally, and sorry about my voice, by the way, it's raspy these days. I think one of the things that struck me the most about the coverage today is that this has been a fundamental departure from the Department of Justice's previous, accepted role as being somewhat impartial as a player in the world of criminal justice. I think what we saw today was we've never seen it, as far as I know, a president calling an AG directly to demand a former FBI director be indicted and arraigned in this way on really what are trumped up charges. They sort of ludicrous charges. And yet they're proceeding. So a lot of that has sort of perverted justice as we know it. It sort of now has become the president's Department of Justice. And there's a real firewall now between the courts and the Department of Justice, which we never used to really think was there. We used to know that, of course, there were separate entities. One was part of the executive, one was the judiciary. But we really can see that difference right now because it's going to be ultimately the courts and also the military, as we found out a few weeks ago, that are going to be what holds up the American Constitution or tries to hold up the American Constitution from what is a remarkable authoritarian grab by the president.
Right. Well, a brazen one. But of course, what's so interesting, about this is that the judge, Nachmanoff, is, I think, how you pronounce his last name. Yes. Right. Is already, I think, sort of dictating his own terms. Right. And he's a Biden appointee, but he's known to be apolitical from everything that I've read. And I mean, the court date, January 5th, the trial date, is quicker than even the Comey team wanted it, right? The special
My understanding
counsel.
is that's what they were asking for. They'd actually, there's a term for it, I don't know the legal term for it, but they demanded a speedy trial, which is why I think they're getting the trial date so early. So I think that was a request, but maybe the date is even earlier than they had anticipated because it certainly is coming very, very quickly.
Very, very quickly. And then when you hear a judge like this, known for no nonsense, say he's allowing for 2 to 3 days in a trial, I mean, my mind, and this is pure speculation, or goes to the thought that, I think a lot of people think these are trumped up charges, no pun intended. It took this friend of President Trump's to actually force an indictment of James Comey in the first place.
Right.
And so, when you hear this is going to be a very quick trial that the judge wants to get it over with as quickly as possible, my mind is already going to that place. Well, then what happens if James Comey, a jury finds him not guilty, which he has pled? Then what is President Trump going to do?
Right. And are there other superseding charges that are going to be brought against him in the interim? I mean, we don't really know the scope of what the president is intending to prosecute when he's talking about all these people from George Soros to Letitia James to Adam Schiff to James Comey. I mean, there seems to be a plan in his mind or someone's mind who's working with him to prosecute a lot of these Democrats, so-called Democrats, liberal-minded officials that have come after him in the past. And that to me is the unknown here. We just don't know whether there's more to this case than we currently know. Like there are 2 indictments there, but there could be so many other things that they find out. The FBI in 2016 was a very operational place. There were spies from all over the world trying to make all sorts of impacts on the events of that election. There were people pushing them email, Hillary Clinton conspiracy. There were people pushing Trump Russia. And James Comey was sort of stuck in the middle of all of that. And so he was a victim, but also now an accused in this process, which he almost had no control over.
Right. But again, you get the sense from this judge, he's pushing this as quickly as he can for a reason. He doesn't want complications. And, at the end of the day, Zev, yes, you see Donald Trump, testing all sorts of boundaries. But even he will find, I think, that the ultimate boundary in our courts is what a jury of 12 people decides.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, even he, I struggle to find a way how he will manage to get around that one.
Maybe he's just in it for the spectacle. Maybe it's okay if he
Right.
realizes that this will be a not guilty charge, verdict. Maybe the spectacle of having, James Comey have to enter that courthouse today, enter a plea, the whole spectacle of the perp walk, the whole idea
Yeah.
of the amount of money this is going to cost the Comeys. I mean, it's going to cost a fortune just to, and the
Right. Raise
headspace,
the defense.
yeah. The emotional bandwidth this is going to require as they worry about, well, what else might be coming down the line? Are there other
Right.
charges coming? And we were talking to Michael Cohen and Lev Parnas, who say hello to you, by the way, earlier on. And Michael was saying this is just the beginning. These are holding charges.
Right.
There is much more to come. He's been there, of course. He's been in
Well, of
that.
course, yes. I was going to say, Michael, if anyone knows the psychology of the president, it is Michael.
Yeah.
And to some degree, Lev,
Yeah.
they've both been on the other side of that. And that the Trump is, I mean, will admit that if somebody punches him, his natural instinct is to punch them back. And he feels that, this is what he went through. So now it's the turn of the people he views as his enemies. So
And
anyway,
Michael feels the same way, by the way. I was really surprised by his reaction when he said, I think he said payback's a bitch, basically, at the end of the interview there, because he feels the same way about James Comey. And, he feels like he's a victim of that FBI in his prosecution, and therefore, James
he's
Comey
not
should be
sorry.
going away. So, even though political ideologies may have changed, it's certainly personal retribution is still the theme of the day.
Yes. Well, it really, really, really is. And on that note, sort of thinking about using the Justice Department for your own ends, I mean, the natural sequitur is to Pam Bondi, once again, not answering questions about the Epstein files and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's questions to her about reporting that's been done about my friend and former colleague, Michael Wolff, and of course the stalling by the Speaker of the House in swearing in the new member of Congress so that this bill can get addressed. I mean, and let's not forget another piece of news I don't think you and I have talked about, and I haven't talked about, which is the Supreme Court refusing to hear Ghislaine Maxwell's appeal, which I did think was interesting, actually, because, people who are better legal brains, than me have, had said that actually there might be some legal rationale for the Supreme Court to hear that case. So the fact that they're not, I think, is interesting. But then on the heels of that, you have Trump being asked if he'll pardon Ghislaine Maxwell, and then he plays dumb. He's playing so dumb that apparently he's forgotten he's already talked about the fact that he could pardon her.
He's very forgetful, that man. He seems to be when he chooses to be.
Right.
But, all those things are such interesting developments. I was really struck that the Supreme Court did not side with her. I thought that, for the most part, I think a lot of Americans believe the Supreme Court has been bought and paid for and is just going to rule on Donald Trump's favor all the time. Now, he may not be in favor of a release, who knows? But if he, if the Supreme Court has turned down their appeal, it does mean that they still are, operating to some extent as an independent body.
Right. And I made a podcast series. I made one about Ghislaine Maxwell, but I made a second one about the Supreme Court and about the Federalist Society. The sort of and the relationship between the conservatives at Yale Law School, who are a tiny minority, but who are very, very powerful, who have this pipeline up to the Supreme Court on the right, not on the left. But and people do forget that this court isn't so much a Trump court. it was actually the Federalist Society who chose the last three conservative judges who Trump signed off on, but they were not handpicked by him. They were handpicked by the Federalist Society. And I don't think they have rubber stamped everything. I mean, they've rubber stamped a lot, but they haven't rubber stamped everything. And I think it's interesting that but not, in some ways, not surprising that they pushed back on Ghislaine Maxwell. I mean, this is still one, I think, of the most horrific crimes that we've seen in this country. And there is something so horrendous about the idea of a woman luring in young girls that I think it's really stomach turning. So I can see why the Supreme Court wouldn't want to wade into this one.
Yeah, it's a really difficult one, obviously, to allow this woman to go free after everything she's, been found guilty of would be stunning and would read like political move. I was struck, and I don't know if you noticed this in the 50th birthday book that came out of Epstein, which she had put together. In it, there's a note from one of his fellow Bear Stearns colleagues, I guess, who said, I remember when I was running the Bob Maxwell account way back in the 70s, and you met him then, and then you also met Ghislaine then, or something to that effect. There was wording around that. Or did you also meet Ghislaine then? And that meant that Ghislaine was probably introduced to Jeffrey Epstein as early as the late 70s, if that is what that in fact means, which when she was a teenager, she would have been very young.
She would have been very, very, very young.
Yeah.
So you and I've talked about this. I don't think that was true. And look, I think there was an awful lot of crap that she spun in her sit down with Todd Blanche.
Yeah.
But I think there were some things that were possibly true, and there were some things that I didn't know before. And, I thought one of the things she said that really struck me as true was how angry Jeffrey Epstein was with her for getting into it with Virginia Giuffre. That struck me as true. We've only ever read, there's one email that I've seen from Jeffrey Epstein to Ghislaine Maxwell about her legal battles with Virginia Roberts. And this was when she called Virginia Roberts a liar in 2015, when Virginia Roberts had come out and basically made all the accusations that, we since have discovered had a lot of truth to them. And Ghislaine Maxwell called Virginia a liar. But when she told Todd Blanche that Jeffrey Epstein had been very angry with her and it had really put a wedge between them, that sounded true to me, because Alan Dershowitz has also told me and said to me on the record that Epstein, what he did when all these allegations came out, was to go to the guys whose names were in the limelight and say, I'll just stop, don't make any noise, I'll pay your legal fees and I'll get this to go away. That's what Epstein wanted. And of course, he was very good at getting legal things to go away, as we know. So I thought that had the kernel of truth. I thought it was really interesting that she mentioned that her boyfriend, Ted Waite, the internet, the tech billionaire, founder of Gateway Computers, who she had seen, I think, as her escape route away from Epstein, that somebody had got hold of his people and said, we'd like $10 million to drop, to make all these noise about Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein go away, and that Ted Waite had no idea about any of it until that phone call came in. I thought that was fairly interesting. And, and I've said, I also thought her whole tone, the way she conducted that interview, it sounded like, if you didn't know better, that she was sitting at Buckingham Palace,
Yeah.
and she and Todd Blanche, were having tea and scones, and it was all, said with this very sort of British upper class entitled background, sort of firmly um, in view. But I don't. I mean, there's no reason to think that she and Epstein were introduced, certainly not in the 1970s. You and I have debated whether or not they met before her dad died. And I think we all know that Jeffrey Epstein definitely knew Robert. He had met
Yeah.
Robert Maxwell.
And
The
been
other
working
thing,
for him as well, I think.
exactly. Yeah. Well, the other thing, though, Steph, that the other connection, and I have written about this, that was interesting to me in the birthday book, was there was a note, clearly a note from the son of Douglas Leese.
Yes, I noticed that.
Um,
It was Nick Leese, right? Yeah.
and
He was his
and that
assistant at Towers. Nick Leese
well
was
well
working with Epstein at Towers Financial, according to Hoffenberg.
well Douglas Leese was more than that. So
Yeah.
Douglas Leese is an British. I mean, his son has told me this isn't true, but he was definitely in the arms dealing space.
Yeah.
And, his name is in the British parliamentary record as being associated with El Yamama, the biggest arms deal that was done. Margaret Thatcher's son, Mark, was involved in it in the 1980s. And we do know that Douglas Leese, quote unquote, mentored Jeffrey Epstein in the 1980s after Epstein was bounced or left Bear Stearns, however you want to put it. And the 1980s is the period where, as described by him, even to me, he's a sort of bounty hunter, right? I mean, it all sounds far-fetched, but bits of it, again, seem to be true. And even Ghislaine Maxwell, I think, did allude to some of this in that conversation with Todd Blanche. I mean, she sounded absurdly naive. She sort of said, "I didn't really understand it." I rather doubt that's true.
Yeah.
Ghislaine
I don't think that's
Maxwell,
true at all. I mean, she was
Ghislaine
around her
Maxwell,
father a
well,
lot, who understood all these deals.
exactly. That's exactly um, correct. But another reason that I'm skeptical of, I know Hoffenberg said that he thought Robert Maxwell set Jeffrey up with his daughter deliberately, is that I somebody did once phone me out of the blue, a big New York socialite who would have been in the same world as Ghislaine Maxwell, and this woman told me, and unfortunately she was off the record, that she believed she had introduced the two of them, and she believed it was right around the time that Robert Maxwell died.
That's interesting because
Yeah,
this note that shows up in the 50th birthday book, it was a surprise to me, and it's sort of I should pull it up here, but it's
yeah.
because
Put it up. It was a question, right? It wasn't
yeah, it was the question: is this when you met the daughter of Maxwell's
right.
daughter? But even the fact that both Bear Stearns was, that Maxwell was a client of Bear Stearns at the same time that Jeffrey Epstein was working there is kind of interesting as well. I mean, it's sort of the likelihood of that.
Right. Because there's a reference right now. I'm getting confused as to where I know this from.
Mm.
That actually, I think Ghislaine Maxwell said this in the interview with Todd Blanche, that her father phoned Ace Greenberg to check Epstein out. Right.
Right.
Then Ace
Right.
Greenberg, who ran Bear Stearns, but Ace Greenberg also, whose child Jeffrey Epstein had tutored. To get into Bear Stearns in the first place. So it is all, I mean, you have pointed out, Zev, correctly, that the concentric circles in this saga around the money, the international influence, the crimes. I mean, it is, they are striking,
Mhm.
if nothing else. They
Yeah,
are, you
it's
know,
bizarre.
they are, yeah. It's the world. It's funny how the world seems to shrink around these people, and that all these people who, at the top of the plutocracy in terms of power and influence and money are all seem to know each other.
They not only seem to know each other, they seem to know each other beyond their periods when you expected them to know each other. Like
Right.
Ace Greenberg also writes Jeffrey Epstein a birthday message in that 50th birthday book, which certainly didn't sound like they lost touch or anything like that. That they were, in fact,
No.
seem to be still working almost 50 years later, 35 years later.
Well,
Um,
that doesn't shock me because do you remember Jimmy Kane, who was Ace's number two at Bear Stearns? That birthday book, the 50th birthday book, let us not forget, was published or given to Jeffrey in January of 2003, which was right in the middle of when the fact checkers at Vanity Fair were putting my piece to
right.
bed. And right before it then comes out, is published in February. And Jimmy Kane had really tried to, woo, you know, woo me and invited me into Bear Stearns, and he was insistent that I know that Jeffrey Epstein had been such a good colleague and that he was such an important client now of the bank. And I do remember speaking to Ace Greenberg as well, much shorter conversation. But I do remember Ace Greenberg at the time, against the giving me the same sort of party line that Jeffrey Epstein was a great guy. He'd been great to work with, and that he was an important client to Bear Stearns.
Yeah.
So,
But when you have, Donald Trump, Bob Maxwell, as they called him, Robert Maxwell, and Jeffrey Epstein in the same, financial world, in the same financial brokerage, it's quite something to think about that. And then, later on, as I'm discovering in my research around the greatest heist, that he doesn't actually leave Bear Stearns. He's still involved in these various offshore holdings that Bear Stearns has. I'm speaking about
oh
Epstein.
yeah,
And
yes.
so that continues on and on and on in this, and Bear Stearns is one financial house, but it seems to have, attracted quite a number of the same types of people.
Well, I think you raise a really interesting point, which is, David Enrich at the New York Times did a really good deep dive a few weeks ago about J.P.
Yeah, it was
Morgan.
awesome. Yeah.
And yeah, and it there was a good reminder that the reason J.P. Morgan was so financially entrenched with Jeffrey Epstein was because really of two things. It was because of this acquisition of this hedge fund Highbridge, which was run by Glenn Dubin.
Mhm.
But it was also because when J.P. Morgan in the 2008 financial crisis, do you remember were forced to acquire Bear Stearns,
Mhm.
sort of 6 months before the Lehman Brothers went under, and there was a sort of run on the banks. So when J.P. Morgan acquired Bear Stearns, they also acquired Jeffrey Epstein. And you do see in some of the discovery why one of the reasons that they're reluctant to bin Jeffrey Epstein as a client is because they're dealing with all this litigation around the Bear Stearns hedge funds.
Right.
So,
Interesting.
so wheels within wheels. And the one thing about, and I asked David, we've recorded an episode, something for NPR that I think hasn't come out yet. But one of the things I asked him, I think it was the night after his piece came out, that I really couldn't understand. And he said, well, actually, nor could he, is why on earth JP Morgan felt, and this was in, the sort of the years 2014, 15, 16, 17, and 18, where, and I'm sure David's reporting on this is right, that JP Morgan people at the bank still went to see Jeffrey Epstein because they viewed him as a very important and necessary conduit to Leon Black. And I'm like, why? would JP Morgan not be capable of having a relationship with Leon Black, one of the richest men in the country, by themselves? It makes no
It
sense
doesn't make
to
any
me.
sense, and Leon Black becomes such an interesting figure, as does Jess Staley throughout the whole period of time. That network is so revealing, and I, I sometimes, there's the offshore holding that Jeffrey Epstein ran for Bear Stearns, called Liquid Funding, was worth an enormous amount of money. It had like about $4.5 billion or something left in it, just before Bear Stearns was bailed out by J.P. Morgan. And what I've been finding out is that J.P. Morgan um, didn't bail out Liquid Funding. But it was bailed out. It was bailed out presumably by either the government funds or the government bailouts that happened at the time, or it was done some other way by Bear Stearns before J.P. Morgan would acquire it, in order to there wouldn't be an acquisition directly of Liquid Funding by J.P. Morgan. But my understanding is that it actually was that potentially the government could have been involved in bailing out Jeffrey Epstein, which, because he was just stunning on the face of it. But, there it is, because, we were in a financial crisis. So,
Yeah.
that whole network, financial network, is stunning to me. And Jamie Dimon's involvement or non-involvement is also really interesting. As were these other names that came up, last week. Elon Musk came up as in the new oversight documents that were put out by the Democrats. There was Peter Thiel seemed to show up there as well. I mean, it's interesting that all the usual suspects, as you point out, a very shrunken world, is sort of all involved in all of this all the time.
Yes. And on one level, because I'd seen in the discovery, but I probably have paid more attention to this than other people. So I had seen Elon's name, and I knew that Peter Thiel had met with Jeffrey Epstein. Because it has been in the discovery. I think that people are just paying attention to it, as they should, this time around when the oversight committee puts it out. But it strikes me that Jeffrey Epstein, in some ways, must have just laughed to himself as he went to sleep every night at what suckers all
Absolutely.
these, the wealthiest people in the world actually were. The fact that it was so easy for him to get meetings with Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Bill Gates, and so on. Bill Burns, even, we've forgotten about him.
Mm-hmm.
Head of the CIA. After Jeffrey Epstein has come out of jail and is a convicted sex offender. Nonetheless, it seems to be so easy for him to just book coffees with all these guys. And I mean, I'm sure, at the very least, what they must feel when they read their names in the Epstein files is embarrassment, because they look like idiots.
They do look like idiots. On the other hand, maybe Epstein really did wield a lot of influence, as and this may answer your Leon Black situation. In the Ehud Barak emails that came out, where Epstein is talking to Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister and defense minister, there is an interesting play that they do together in order to introduce each other to different people. It's a sort of, I'll tell them to contact you because this is, the beneficial to them. So these are two powerful people playing a game together in order to entice other individuals to join their causes. And, in some cases it was business causes, in other cases it might have been political. But I think that's the way he operated. He was quite an expert at leveraging the power of the Russians, the power of the Israelis, in order to leverage other people into the network. And then, of course, Lutnick's comments last week,
Right.
which are also just stunning. And this is the guy who was next door neighbor to him for 25 years. And
Right.
also probably a part of that network, despite his denials. It's
and let's not forget Peter Mandelson.
Yeah, right.
The British ambassador who just had to, quit.
Yeah.
over all of this. I mean, he in some ways is an unexpected person to have in that web. He's definitely not interested in young girls.
Mm.
He's openly gay. But Peter Mandelson has long been drawn to wealthy,
Yeah.
very wealthy people.
Oleg Deripaska amongst them, I think.
Right. But
Yeah.
I mean, if you, yes, exactly. But if you, if you think about it, if you're Jeffrey Epstein, what's Peter Mandelson's use to you? Well, it was because at the time, Peter Mandelson had a very big job in Europe.
Mm.
At the same, and again, what was Prince Andrew's use to Epstein? Well, Prince Andrew, who I think we all know now as not the brightest bulb that ever bloomed, but he was at one point, British trade envoy.
Yeah.
So that's what makes him appealing to a guy like Jess Staley at JP Morgan, because Prince Andrew can get into rooms that Jess Staley, no matter how senior he is at JP Morgan, can't get into.
Mm.
And
That's
Mandelson,
interesting.
So in a way, what Epstein did so brilliantly was he understood that if he dangled Mandelson, if he dangled Prince Andrew, he dangles Ehud Barak, he dangled at one point an Oxford professor do you remember in the legal papers to
I don't
Jess
remember that,
Staley
but I
to
believe
go
that.
to educate him on China, and you think, well, does Jess Staley not, can he not educate himself? But it's very clever. And what's interesting, it works. I mean, that is, I wonder who he dangled, and the tech bros are all so competitive with each other that he probably understood that once he got Bill Gates in the room, well, then that's enough of a calling card. Elon doesn't want to miss out. Peter Thiel doesn't want to miss out if Elon's in the room.
Right.
It's all that, I think that's what Epstein really knew how to do.
Yeah, and so it's sort of a triangulation of power, really. He doesn't have it, but he's able to sort of gain it through the people he's introducing to each other. And I find it, the political piece of all of this, that, Ari Ben-Menashe claimed, and as did Hoffenberg, that Epstein was representing the Israeli government or the Israeli military intelligence in an effort to stop Bill Clinton from getting too cozy with the Palestinians for a deal back then. And so his efforts around the Democrats to blackmail Democrats was about that. But he was also looking for influence in that world. And that's maybe explains Mandelson, maybe it explains some of these others, George Mitchell as well, that they were looking for people to blunt the peace process.
Yes, and also don't forget, when we go back in time to the Clinton era, and I think the Israelis were concerned about at the beginning of the Clinton presidency what direction his foreign policy would take in the Middle East. And now, again, we've got Jared Kushner, who obviously does walk very easily between the Gulf states and between Israel. But again, in the Clinton era, that wasn't such a thing.
No.
And so the fact that Jeffrey Epstein again had Mohammed bin Salman, now the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, in his townhouse in New York, the fact that he could walk in that corridor, I think did make him, it might not translate to the times we live in now because they're different. But I think back then it wasn't so. There weren't that many people who could talk easily to the leaders of all these countries at the same time.
It's really difficult. And then I'm always reminded by the two paintings that Epstein had in his home. One of Bill Clinton in a blue dress, and then the other one of George Bush playing with dominoes of the World Trade Center collapse. Both of which are sort of, are intriguing questions about, or suggest maybe that there is some connection there. I don't know. Maybe there is. This tantalizing theory. Of course, it's nothing proven. But why would he have those paintings in his home? And what exactly was he driving at with having them there? Was it part of his? Could it be that the Monica Lewinsky thing was Israeli trap or some sort of trap to get the president. It's not unthinkable. It's certainly within their MO. And so what was his involvement in all of that? It's just so
Right.
curious that he would have that particular painting of his friend,
Well, but it's
of his friend.
also, yes, but it's also, though, a classic. When I said to you that image that I have in my head of Jeffrey Epstein laughing to himself last
Mm,
thing at night, it's like, ha, I got you. I'm
yeah,
one up. At the end of the day, um, it's a sort of expression of his superiority, isn't it? I'm going to have a joke at your,
exactly.
public laugh at you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And this is his
and
friends. These are people that he was supportive of. These are people that he, supposedly started the global initiative, Clinton Global Initiative for. So it's always striking that he would have things like that up there. But I'm curious to know what you think of the Speaker of the House's attempts now to suppress all of this. Because to me, it looks like it's bordering. It was a cover up, sure. Now it's almost like a conspiracy to obstruct justice. It's like you're
right,
actually holding back documents that the world needs to see for judiciary reasons, for judicial reasons, and for
yeah.
prosecutions. And these people like Pam Bondi and Johnson seem to be setting themselves up for that kind of fall later on.
Right. Well, obviously, the hope is, and that Trump is brilliant at the
Mm,
art of distraction, right? And the
yeah.
hope is that with the government shut down, and with the Comey spectacle, and with what's going on, the talks about Gaza. I mean, the latest thing I just saw before you and I hopped on, right, is that Trump might be going, flying out to Egypt.
Oh, is he
Um,
really?
yeah,
To plant
and
the flag for the Trump Gaza hotel and resort?
well, not yet, but I expect. So,
Too soon.
yeah. So, um, uh, so anyway, I mean, he can distract and distract, but only for so long.
You-
I'm gonna hope that stops going.
That's okay.
Um,
If you need to get us,
hold on, Deb. Sorry,
no worries.
let me just get rid of it. Hold
No worries. I'll just talk to you all about it while we wait here a little bit. Lovely talking to Vicky
on.
Ward. There you go.
um, so yeah, no. So I think he can distract for only so long, right?
Yeah.
There's, his own MTG is still baying for she. I mean, I think that they've got enough support, right? The Republicans want the answers to this. Trump's base, I think, still wants the answer to this. We've got Virginia Giuffre's memoir
Mhm.
is coming out imminently in the next couple of weeks. I understand from Tara Palmieri, again, who was part of this thing we recorded for NPR, that there's going to be a lot of news in that. So I think, we should all, because when that comes out, if there is, Tara says it's sensational,
Wow.
and there are going to be names that shock all of us, big names. And, I suspect that the drumbeat from Trump's base will get louder and louder. And he can't, they're putting it off and they're putting it off, but they can run, but they can't hide forever on this. They just can't.
I think that's very true. And as you watch them try to rush into autocracy in the way they are, they're doing it at sort of a breakneck speed because I think they know the writing's on the wall, that down the line,
Yeah.
too much is going to come out that's going to make it impossible for them to do all of this. And it might be impossible right now for the same reasons. But I'm looking forward to that book a lot. I think it'll be really interesting what names she has in there. And I think, because she passed away, of course. She's committed
Yeah.
suicide. So she's not going to pay the ultimate price for this. But we shall see what it, and that'll mean that all the names in there are probably true, and she's not hiding anything, and it'll be interesting to see what names come up. I'll be fascinated.
I know. I think I've got someone knocking at my door. So
I know I got to run to another thing too. But thank you so much, Vicky. It's so great to catch up with you on this and on Comey, and
yeah,
hopefully we'll talk again soon.
absolutely. Take care.
Cheers. Have a good one. Bye bye.
Bye.